Philip Norman, a British author, has admitted that he used to share the perspective of Paul McCartney as someone who was blessed with such tremendous skills that he must be delighted with himself. His latest biography, Paul McCartney, The Life, is a complete chronicle that was released on Tuesday night. He claims that for a considerable amount of time, many believed that Norman, who is 73 years old and was born 10 months before McCartney, was anti-Paul. He had a brief encounter with McCartney in 1965, when he was working as a rock journalist covering the Beatles. As Norman writes in The Life, the book Shout! The Beatles in Their Generation was published in 1981. It was met with some criticism due to its excessive adoration of John Lennon and its bias against McCartney. In addition, Paul himself was adamantly opposed to the book, according to what I received. Then, however, Norman came to the realization that the live rock legend is also afraid of himself. Even though he is now in his 70s, he continues to believe that he must demonstrate his worth practically every night that he performs on stage. The month of April saw the beginning of McCartney's new tour, which was titled One on One. Think about how surprised Norman was when McCartney called him personally, more than 20 years after the initial phone call. McCartney agreed to respond to any factual questions that were posed to him by email. The author was working on another biography, which was titled John Lennon, The Life, and had reached out to McCartney. Once more, McCartney gave his tacit assent, citing the rock icon's letter, for a book that may trace his own story through the medium of email, approximately 3.5 years ago. Norman acknowledges that I was ignorant and even a little bit resentful of him when he was explaining his own change of heart. Years I'd spent wishing to be him, the author says at the beginning of Paul McCartney The Life, Little Brown, which is a biography of the musician. As Norman puts it, the widespread misconception that John was the avant-garde and daring Beatle, while Paul was classified as the safe and mainstream one, is certainly demolished in The Life, which measures more than 800 pages in length. Paul was actually responsible for some of the most experimental stuff that the Beatles produced, but he was constantly under the shadow of that misperception. McCartney, who had been interested in contemporary art since he was a young lad living in working-class Liverpool, was living in the heart of London while John was in the suburbs. This was true even within the confines of the studio. In spite of the fact that Paul was a more moderate person, John had a far more addicted nature, and he taught John about Timothy Leary and LSD. John was able to comprehend this. Norman, who recounts the lively bachelorhood that McCartney enjoyed before marrying American photographer Linda Eastman, who became his musical collaborator in Wings, and a noted animal rights activist before dying of illness in 1998, makes a remark that Lennon was also the serially monogamous one. Norman's book documents the frisky bachelorhood that McCartney has enjoyed. Norman, who compares McCartney to David Beckham these days, says that many did not believe that this tremendously personable and good-looking music singer wanted to settle down. The idea of having a family was very important to Paul. Angie, McCartney's stepmother, and Ruth, the pop star's stepsister, both testify to the pop star's natural relationship with children. The Life features interviews with both of these individuals. Heather, Linda's daughter, is one of the 5 children that McCartney has, and he adopted her. John Eastman, Linda's brother and the attorney who represented Paul McCartney in his lawsuit against the other Beatles and Apple Records in 1970, was another person that Norman communicated with. We also look at McCartney's subsequent troubles with his second wife Heather Mills and with the copyrights to Beatles songs, which were famously awarded to Michael Jackson. On the other hand, Norman is adamant that McCartney is not interested in becoming wealthy in the end. The affection that is shown to Paul is so tremendous, and it comes from a great number of people, according to Norman. He really can't function properly without it. And in return, he bestows onto them an immense amount of joy.